The cold came without warning that morning. Cora felt it the moment she stepped out of the small stone cottage, a sharp wind cutting through the wool of her gray cloak, finding every gap, every worn thread, every place where the fabric had thinned from too many winters of use. She pulled the cloak tighter around her shoulders and kept walking, her worn leather boots pressing into the frost-hardened mud of the village path. She had 4 children to feed. The cold could wait. The market of Ashvale was already alive with noise and smoke when she arrived. The sharp scent of burning pine from the vendor fires, the heavy smell of salted meat hanging from iron hooks, the faint sweetness of dried herbs bundled and tied with rough twine. Cora moved through the narrow lanes with practiced efficiency, her golden braids swaying at her back, her pale blue eyes scanning every stall with careful calculation. She carried a small leather pouch at her hip, and inside it, the coins she had earned from 3 days of mending, torn tunics and patching guard cloaks for the lower ward soldiers. It wasn't much. It was never much. But it was enough if she was careful, if she chose correctly, if she didn't linger too long and let sentiment override arithmetic. She stopped at the grain merchant's stall and asked for 2 measures of oat flour. The merchant, a wide man with a red nose and a permanent expression of mild contempt for anyone he suspected couldn't afford his finest stock, looked her over once and named a price that was 3 copper pieces higher than last week. "The roads from the northern mills are frozen," he said, as if that explained everything. Cora looked at the sacks of flour behind him. She looked at the price. She looked at her pouch. 1 measure, she said quietly. "And a handful of dried lentils, if you'll take the same price." The merchant shrugged and began scooping. He didn't apologize for the increase. People like him never did. She was reaching for the coins when she heard it. A sound that moved through the market like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward in every direction until everything else went silent. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't a horn. It was simply the weight of many boots striking cobblestone in perfect disciplined unison, and the particular stillness that fell over a crowd when something powerful was approaching. And every living creature with any instinct at all understood without being told that it was wise to step aside. Cora tucked her flour and lentils under her arm and turned. The royal escort came through the main arch of Ashvale's eastern gate in 2 columns. Mounted soldiers in black leather armor with silver wolf insignias pressed into the breastplates, their horses dark and enormous, breath steaming in the cold morning air. The royal banner snapped in the wind above them. Black field, silver wolf, a crown of thorned branches above its head, the banner of Dawnmere, the banner of the Alpha King. Cora had seen that banner in drawings. She had never seen it in person. She pressed herself against the merchant's stall along with everyone else, her flour held to her chest, watching. The crowd around her had gone from market noise to church silence in a matter of seconds. An old woman beside Cora made a small, involuntary sound and gripped her basket with both hands. He rode at the center of the column. Even if she hadn't known to look for him, she would have found him. There was something about the way he occupied space, not loudly, not with display or performance, but with a density that made everything around him seem slightly less real by comparison. He was large, broader across the shoulders than any man she had seen in Ashvale, his dark hair pulled back in long braids that fell past his jaw, his eyes the deep, sharp blue of a winter sky just before a storm. A cloak of black wolf fur hung from his shoulders, pinned at the chest with a silver clasp shaped like a crescent moon. He wore leather armor layered with dark iron buckles and straps across the chest and on his left cheekbone. A thin, pale scar caught the pale morning light. King Aidan of Dawnmere did not look at the crowd. He looked ahead, calm and utterly still, atop his black horse, as if the world rearranging itself around him was simply the natural order of things. Cora told herself to look away. She had bread to buy and children waiting. She looked away. She made it exactly 4 stalls before it happened. The small voice came from somewhere near her knee. "Mama, I dropped it," and she turned to find that she was no longer alone. Somehow. Impossibly. Despite having left all 4 of them with their neighbor Edna not 20 minutes ago. The smallest one had followed her. Little Pip, 5 years old. with his mother's pale eyes and a perpetually untied bootlace, was standing in the middle of the market lane, holding out an empty wooden cup with a look of absolute tragedy on his small face. "Pip," her voice came out sharper than she meant it to. "You were supposed to stay with Edna." Edna fell asleep, he said simply, as if this was a perfectly reasonable explanation for everything. Cora closed her eyes for 1 second. Then she took the cup from him, took his hand, and turned to move back toward the edge of the lane, directly into the path of a royal guardsman's horse, which had stepped sideways to avoid a loose cartwheel, and which was now very suddenly very large and very close. The horse shied. The guardsman cursed. Cora pulled Pip hard against her side and stumbled backward, her flour sack hitting the ground, spilling pale dust across the cobblestones, her coin pouch slipping from her hip and landing with a sound that seemed in the awful silence that followed very loud and very final. She stood there, flour on her boots, her child pressed against her side, her coins scattered across the stones, while 12 royal guards stared at her. And then she became aware with a cold certainty that had nothing to do with the wind, that the column had stopped, that the horse at the center of the column had stopped, that the man on that horse was looking at her, not at the crowd, not at the disruption, at her. Cora straightened her back. It was instinct, the same instinct that had kept her standing through things much worse than spilled flour. She met his gaze for exactly 1 second. And in that second, she saw something into those blue eyes that she had not expected to find in the face of a king. He wasn't annoyed. He wasn't dismissive. He was watching her the way a man watches something that has surprised him and is still deciding what to make of it. One of his guards dismounted immediately and began collecting her scattered coins from the cobblestones, placing them back into her pouch with quick, precise movements. She hadn't asked for help. She didn't know what to do with it. "Are you injured?" The voice came from above her. She looked up. The Alpha King had moved his horse 2 steps closer, and from this distance, the scar on his cheekbone was clearly visible, a clean, thin line that told the story of a blade passing very close to something vital. His blue eyes were fixed on her with an attention that felt almost physical. Cora squared her shoulders. "No," she said. "My lord." She added the title a beat too late. She saw him notice. "The child?" he asked. "He's mine," she said. "He's unharmed." Pip, pressed against her side, chose this moment to look up at the king with the unfiltered curiosity of a 5-year-old who had not yet learned to be afraid of powerful men, and said with complete sincerity, "Your horse is very big." The silence that followed lasted exactly 2 seconds. Something shifted in the Alpha King's expression. Not quite a smile, but the shadow of one, moving through his eyes like light through a crack in stone. The guard returned her coin pouch. She took it with both hands and held it against her chest alongside what remained of her flour. "Thank you," she said, looking at the guard, not at the king. She turned to leave. She had taken 3 steps when the king's voice stopped her again, low and carrying despite the noise of the market beginning cautiously to breathe again around them. "What is your name?" Cora turned back. She held her son's hand in her ruined flower and looked up at the most powerful alpha in 4 kingdoms. "Cora," she said, "of Ashevale." He said nothing for a moment. "Then you held your ground." "Cora of Ashevale." She didn't answer that. She didn't know how to answer that. She simply dipped her chin, turned again, and walked steadily, deliberately, without looking back toward the bread stall at the far end of the market. It was only when she had turned the corner, out of sight of the column and the banner and those impossible blue eyes, that she allowed herself to exhale. Pip tugged her hand. "Mama, who was that man?" "No one you need to think about," she said. But her heart was still beating too fast, and the coin pouch in her hand felt heavier than it should. And somewhere deep in the part of her that she had learned over years and grief and survival to keep very quiet, something had shifted. She walked faster. Edna was awake by the time Cora returned, sitting upright in her chair by the hearth, with the guilty expression of someone who had very recently been asleep and was pretending otherwise. The cottage was warm. smelling of wood smoke and the faint sweetness of dried lavender hanging from the low ceiling beams. 3 children sat on the rush-covered floor near the fire. Marin, 9 years old and sharp as a new blade, with Cora's golden hair and a permanent look of mild suspicion about everything. The twins, Bram and Sella, 7 years old and identical in face, but opposite in temperament. Bram quiet and watchful, Sella loud enough for both of them. Pip ran past Cora the moment the door opened and threw himself into the middle of the group with the energy of someone who had experienced a great adventure and needed to report it immediately. "I saw a king," he announced. 3 heads turned toward Cora. She set down her flower, her remaining coins, and her cloak, and said with the practiced calm of a woman who had learned that children absorb panic the way dry wool absorbs water. The royal column passed through the market. It was nothing. Marin looked at her with those 2 perceptive gray eyes. "Was it King Aidan? Where did you hear that name?" Cora asked. "Edna talks in her sleep," Marin said simply. Edna made a sound of dignified protest from her chair. Cora moved to the hearth and began portioning out what she had bought. Oat flour, lentils, half a round of hard cheese. She had traded a mended cloak for 2 days ago, and 3 small turnips that had cost her more than they should have. It wasn't enough for a feast. It was enough for a warm meal and breakfast tomorrow, and she had learned a long time ago that enough was something to be grateful for, rather than ashamed of. She was stirring the lentils into the pot when Edna appeared at her elbow, lowered herself carefully onto the bench beside the fire, and said quietly enough that the children couldn't hear, "The king's men have been going door to door in the upper ward." Cora kept stirring. Looking for what? Not what. Who? Edna folded her hands in her lap. "Word is the king requires a record of all unaffiliated Omegas within the borders of Ashvale. Any without a pack bond, without a household claim." She paused. "Without a mate." The wooden spoon went still in Cora's hand. "There are laws," she said carefully. "There are," Edna agreed, "and kings make them." Cora said nothing. She started stirring again. She was not afraid of laws. She had lived under difficult ones before, and had learned to navigate them the way water navigates stone, not by breaking through, but by finding the path of least resistance. What made her stomach tighten now was not the law itself, but the timing of it. The particular coincidence of a royal column arriving on the same morning she had spilled flour at the feet of the Alpha King, and his impossible blue eyes had found her face in a crowd of 200 people. She told herself it meant nothing. Coincidences were not portents. Kings did not notice Omega women carrying children and ruined flour through village markets. She fed the children, told them 2 rounds of the story about the fox and the river spirit, and put them to bed on their shared pallet beneath the window, tucking the heaviest wool blanket around all 4 of them until only a row of small heads was visible. Pip was asleep before she had finished the story. Sella was asleep halfway through. Bram and Marin held out longer, Bram with his quiet eyes open in the dark, Marin pretending to sleep while almost certainly thinking about something she would ask about in the morning with the precision of a trained interrogator. Cora sat by the dying fire for a long time after the cottage quiet around her. She thought about her late husband, Ralph, who had been a beta soldier and a decent man, and who had died of a fever when Marin and Bram were barely 3 years old, leaving her with 4 children under 5. And a small inheritance that had lasted less than 2 winters. She thought about the years since, the mending work, the cold mornings, the careful arithmetic of survival, the way she had built something small and fragile and entirely her own out of the ruins of what grief had left behind. She thought about a pair of blue eyes and a voice that had said, "You held your ground," as if that were something worth remarking upon. She went to bed before she could think anything further. The king's men came to her door the following morning. 2 guards in black leather, silver wolf insignias gleaming on their chests, standing in her doorway with their hands clasped behind their backs and a scroll of parchment between them. Cora answered the door in her linen dress with her braid half finished, a piece of toast in one hand, and the general chaos of 4 children eating breakfast audible behind her. "Cora of Ashvale," the taller guard said. "Yes," she said. "You are summoned to present yourself before His Majesty, King Aidan of Dawn." At the Lord's Hall before the midday bell. Cora looked at the scroll. She looked at the guards behind her. She heard Marin's chair scraped back. "What for?" Cora asked. The guard blinked as if this question had not been part of his preparation. "The summons does not specify, my lady." "I'm not a lady," she said. "I'm an Omega without a pack bond, which I suspect is why I'm being summoned." She took a measured breath. "Tell me, am I required to appear, or is this a request?" The second guard, shorter and younger, exchanged a brief look with his partner. "It is strongly encouraged," he said. "Then I'll come," she said. "But I'll need until the midday bell because I have 4 children to arrange care for, and I won't leave them unsettled." The taller guard opened his mouth, closed it, nodded. She closed the door. Marin was standing 3 steps behind her with her arms crossed and her gray eyes very sharp. "You're going to the king," she said. It was not a question. "I'm going to a meeting," Cora said carefully, "with the king. Marin. Ma." Pip said his horse was very big. Cora pressed her fingers briefly to her forehead. "Eat your breakfast," she said, "and stop listening at doors." She arrived at the Lord's Hall of Ashvale 12 minutes before the midday bell, wearing her best dress, a deep green wool that had been let out twice and mended once at the left, sleeve with a clean linen underdress and her gray cloak freshly brushed. Her braid was neat, pinned at the base of her neck, and she had worn her good boots, the ones with only 1 worn heel instead of 2. She looked, she hoped, like a woman who was composed and reasonable, and not in the least bit intimidated. She was somewhat intimidated. The hall had been transformed from its usual function as Ashvale's seat of minor, noble affairs into something that carried the unmistakable weight of royal presence. The Alpha King's banner hung from the rafters. Candles burned in the iron chandeliers despite the midday hour, and the long table at the head of the hall was occupied by 3 of the king's senior men, their leather armor catching the candlelight, their expressions uniformly serious. Aidan stood at the far end of the hall, not at the table, but beside the tall arched window, looking out at the gray sky above Ashvale's rooftops. He wore his black leather armor, the fur-lined cloak, the crossed chest straps. His braids were loose today, falling past his jaw. He did not turn when she entered. The man at the center of the table did. He was lean, dark-eyed, with the particular expression of someone who managed difficult logistics and had opinions about everything. He looked at Cora the way a man looks at a problem he is trying to solve before it becomes his problem. "Cora of Ashvale," he said. "I am Gareth, the king's gamma and head of the royal household." He set down his quill. "Please sit." She sat. "You are an unaffiliated Omega," he said. "Widowed, 4 children. No pack bond since your husband's passing 4 years ago." "That is correct," she said. "The king is seeking to fill several positions within the royal household at Donmere Keep." He folded his hands. "A domestic position overseeing the care and management of the inner keep's lower quarters, meals, linens, provisions, the general order of the servants' hall." Cora looked at him. "And you're offering this to me?" "We are considering you," Gareth said. He had the tone of a man who did not offer things so much as distribute them after careful evaluation. "The position includes lodging within the keep walls, a weekly stipend in silver, and meals for your household." Cora was quiet for a moment. She was very good at making her face reveal nothing when she needed to. "My children would come with me," she said. It was not a question. "That is," Gareth began. "Non-negotiable," she said. The word landed in the hall like a dropped coin, from the far end of the room at the arched window. There was a sound, not a laugh, not quite, but something that might have been the cousin of one, brief and low before it disappeared. Gareth looked briefly toward the window, then back at Cora. He cleared his throat. "I should warn you," she said before he could speak again, her voice even and clear. "I have 4 children. They are young and they're not quiet, and wherever I go, they go." A pause filled the hall. Then the Alpha King turned from the window. He looked at her across the length of the room with those sharp blue eyes, and something in his expression, some tension she hadn't noticed until it released, softened by the smallest, most deliberate degree, "Perfect," he said. His voice was low and unhurried. "This pack has been too quiet." Dawnmere Keep rose from the hillside like something the earth itself had decided to grow. Dark stone walls climbing upward in uneven towers. Narrow windows glowing amber in the late afternoon gray. The whole structure wrapped in the particular silence of a place that had held too many people for too long and had slowly, quietly emptied out. Cora saw it first from the ridge of the road as the royal carriage crested the hill, and her immediate thought was that it looked less like a palace and more like a fortress that had forgotten what it was protecting. Her second thought was that Sella was going to touch every stone wall she could find, and Bram was going to disappear into the first dark corridor that presented itself, and Pip was going to ask the Alpha King about his horse again. She had 3 days to prepare for the journey, which was barely enough time to pack what they owned. Say farewell to Edna, who had wept with a ferocity that suggested she was crying for reasons beyond the immediate goodbye, and explain to 4 children in age appropriate terms that their lives were about to change significantly. Marin had listened to the explanation with her arms crossed and her gray eyes moving from Cora's face to the middle distance and back again, processing in the methodical way she processed everything. At the end, she had said, "Why did the king pick you specifically?" "He didn't," Cora said. His household steward identified suitable candidates. Marin had looked at her with the expression of a 9-year-old who knew she was being given a partial answer and had filed the rest of her questions for later. Cora had not slept well for 3 nights running. The keep's inner courtyard smelled of hay, iron, and cold stone, with an undercurrent of wood smoke from the great hearths that were apparently kept burning at all hours. 2 stable boys stood frozen in place as the carriage rolled through the gate, staring at the unusual sight of 4 children spilling out onto the cobblestones, with the barely contained energy of people who had been sitting still for 4 hours and had reached their absolute limit. Gareth was waiting in the courtyard with a scroll and an expression of controlled apprehension that Cora suspected was his natural state. He looked at the children. He looked at Cora. He made a small notation on his scroll. "Welcome to Dawnmere Keep," he said in the tone of a man welcoming a natural disaster he had personally approved. "Thank you," Cora said. "Where are our quarters?" He led them through a side entrance, down a corridor of dark stone softened by tapestries in deep burgundy and gray, past a great hall that smelled of pine resin and old candle wax, and up a narrow stair to a set of rooms in the eastern wing. The rooms were not lavish, but they were solid. Thick walls, a proper hearth already lit, 2 sleeping chambers separated by a small sitting room, and a window that looked out over a walled garden where something brown and frostbitten had once presumably been green. Sella immediately claimed the window. Pip immediately claimed the hearthstone. Bram walked the perimeter of both rooms in silence, touching the walls at intervals as if confirming they were real. Marin stood in the center of the sitting room and looked at everything once, carefully before nodding to herself in private confirmation of something. "It's adequate," she said. Gareth blinked at her. "She means thank you," Cora said. The keep had a rhythm, and Cora learned it the way she learned everything. By watching, by listening, by paying attention to the spaces between what people said and what they actually meant. She was given charge of the inner keep's lower quarters, the servants' hall, the linen stores, the kitchen provisioning schedule, the management of 9 domestic servants who had apparently been operating without consistent oversight for the better part of a year, and had developed opinions about this that ranged from relief to resentment. The head kitchen woman was named Bertha, wide, capable, with forearms like a blacksmith and a voice that could cut through stone. She looked at Cora on the first morning with the particular assessment of a woman who had survived multiple changes of management and was reserving judgment. "You're the Omega from Ashvale," she said. "I am," Cora said, "with 4 children." "Also correct." Bertha looked at her for a long moment. Then she handed her a ladle and said, "Breakfast porridge won't stir itself." And that apparently was that. The other servants were more cautious. There was a hierarchy within the keep that Cora navigated carefully. The upper servants who answered to Gareth and considered themselves a distinct class from the lower hall staff. The guards, who had their own internal order and largely ignored the domestic staff unless food was involved. And the wolf pack members of the king's inner circle, 3 betas and 2 gammas, who moved through the keep with the ease of people who had lived there long enough to own it in all but name. The one who concerned her most was not any of them. His name was Dane, and he was the king's beta lieutenant. Tall, dark-haired, with a lean face and quick eyes that missed very little. He had been at the hall in Asheville during the summons. The man she had identified as someone who managed difficult logistics and had opinions. He watched her navigate the keep's dynamics during her first 3 days with an expression that was not hostile, but was not warm. The expression of a man who was waiting to understand what category she belonged to before deciding how to treat her. On the 4th morning, he appeared in the servants' hall doorway while she was reviewing the week's provisioning list with Bertha. "The king wants the Eastern study aired and the candles replaced before evening," he said. Not to Bertha. To Cora. "I'll see to it," she said without looking up from the list. "He also wants to know if the children have been given appropriate space." A pause. His words. Cora looked up. Man. Dane's expression gave away nothing. But there was something in the way he had delivered the message carefully, as if it were fragile, that told her it had surprised him to be asked to deliver it. "Tell the king the children are settled," she said, "and thank him for his consideration." Dane nodded and left. Bertha beside her said nothing, but Cora felt the kitchen woman's attention shift and recalibrate the way attention does when something unexpected happens and a person is revising their understanding of a situation. She saw the king properly for the first time on the 5th day. She had been in the keep for nearly a week, and their interactions had been limited to the hall in Asheville, and one brief moment in the corridor on the 2nd day when they had passed each other going in opposite directions, and he had nodded to her in a way that seemed to carry more weight than a nod strictly required. She had nodded back. They had continued in their respective directions. On the 5th day, she was crossing the inner courtyard at dusk, carrying a basket of fresh-aired linens back toward the eastern wing, when she heard a sound from the small training yard adjacent to the stables. The rhythmic, focused sound of someone working through forms alone. The whisper of leather on stone. The controlled exhale of effort. She should not have looked. She was aware that she should not have looked. She looked. He was training without armor. A plain dark tunic. Leather breeches. Boots worn to the shape of long use. His braids were tied back from his face, and in the gray evening light, the scar on his cheekbone was very visible, a thin, pale line against the darker warmth of his skin. He moved through their training forms with an economy that spoke of years rather than practice. Nothing wasted, nothing performed. Every motion arriving exactly where it needed to, and no further. He saw her the moment she stopped. He didn't stop moving. He finished the form. One slow, final rotation of the wooden practice blade, and then he stilled and looked at her across the yard with those blue eyes that had found her face in a market crowd of 200 people. "The linens needed airing," she said, which was not what she had intended to say, but was what came out. "They did," he agreed, as if this were a reasonable exchange to be having. He set the practice blade against the fence post. "How is the keep treating you?" She considered the question honestly. "The work is clear," she said. "The people are watchful. I think they're deciding what to make of me. And what do you make of them?" She shifted the linen basket slightly. "Bertha is the real authority in the lower hall and has been for years. The upper servants resent being coordinated by someone they didn't choose. Gareth is fair but efficient to the point of coldness." She paused. "Your beta lieutenant thinks I'm either a complication or an asset and hasn't decided which." Aiden was quiet for a moment. In the silence, a horse shifted in the stable behind her, and somewhere above the courtyard, the first star appeared in the darkening sky. "And which are you?" he asked. "I've always managed to be useful," she said. "Complications are usually just problems that haven't been given enough time." The shadow of that almost smile moved through his eyes again, the same one she had seen in the market when Pip had commented on the horse. It came and went quickly, but she was watching for it this time. "Your son," he said. "The youngest one." "Pip," she said. "He asked my headgroom this morning whether the black horse was the biggest horse in the kingdom, or just the biggest horse in this part of the kingdom." Cora closed her eyes briefly. "I apologize." The groom spent 20 minutes explaining the answer. Aiden said, It was the most animated I have seen him in months. She opened her eyes. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't fully read. Something open in it. Something that did not belong to the public face of a king, but to the private face of a man, and the distinction felt important and slightly dangerous. "Good night, my lord," she said. "Good night." "Cora," he said. She walked back to the eastern wing with steady steps and a linen basket that suddenly seemed to weigh nothing at all, and she did not allow herself to think about the way her name had sounded in his voice until she was safely inside her room, with the door closed behind her. Then she sat on the edge of the bed in the quiet dark and thought about it for exactly 1 minute. Then she stopped. She was a practical woman. She had 4 children and a provisioning list and a head kitchen woman to manage, and absolutely no room in her life for the particular foolishness that came from reading warmth into the voice of a king who was simply being courteous. She lay down, pulled the blanket up, and told herself to sleep. Sleep for once came quickly. But her last thought before it did was not about the provisioning list. The frost came early to Dawnmere that year. By the 3rd week of Cora's arrival, the walled garden outside her window had surrendered entirely to white, and the corridors of the keep held a cold that no amount of hearth fire fully reached. The servants moved through their days wrapped in extra layers, breath visible in the early mornings, and Bertha had taken to keeping a pot of spiced broth simmering on the kitchen hearth at all hours, which Cora had quietly approved, and Gareth had quietly chosen not to comment on. The children had adapted with the resilience that children apply to most things when given warmth. Food, and enough space to move. Pip had formed an alliance with the head groom, a weathered man named Oswin, and could be found in the stables most afternoons asking questions at a rate that would have exhausted a younger man. Sella had discovered the keep's upper corridors and their echoing acoustics, and had been twice redirected from shouting experiments that disturbed the guard rotation. Bram had found the keep's small archive room, a narrow chamber off the great hall where maps and old records were stored, and had taken to sitting there in companionable silence with the elderly scribe who managed the collection, an arrangement that suited both of them perfectly. Marin had made no friends and required none. She watched everything, said little, and had taken to appearing silently at Cora's elbow during the day in a way that suggested she was conducting her own private assessment of Dawnmere Keep and its inhabitants, and had not yet reached her conclusions. It was Marin who first said it aloud. They were in the sitting room one evening, the fire burning low, the twins already asleep, Pip drowsing against Cora's side while she worked on a torn hem by candlelight. Marin sat across from her, supposedly reviewing the letters she was practicing, but her quill had been still for several minutes. "The king watches you," Marin said. Cora did not look up from the hem. "Kings observe their households, not the way he watches you," Marin said with the devastating precision of a 9-year-old who had not yet learned to soften observations. "It's different, like how Oswin watches the black horse, like he's checking that something is still there." Cora set down the hem. She looked at her daughter across the candlelight at those gray eyes that had been too old for their age since the day Ralph died, and Marin had understood before any of the others that something had permanently changed. "You notice too much," Cora said gently. "You notice it too," Marin said. "You just don't say it." Cora picked up the hem again. "Sleep," she said. "It's late." Marin went to bed without argument, which was its own kind of answer. The trouble arrived in the form of a visitor. His name was Lord Cedric of Westmark, and he came to Dawnmere Keep on a grey Thursday morning with an escort of 40 riders, and the particular energy of a man who considered his own arrival an event of some significance. He was perhaps 50 years old, broad and well-fed, with a graying beard and pale eyes that moved over everything they encountered with the assessing quality of a merchant calculating value. He wore a fur-lined cloak of dark red and silver rings on 3 fingers, and he greeted Aidan in the great hall with the elaborate warmth of someone performing friendship rather than feeling it. Cora observed this from the servants' corridor, where she had come to ensure the welcome meal was properly staged. She noticed the warmth. She noticed what was underneath it. She said nothing and went back to the kitchen. Dane appeared at the kitchen doorway an hour later. "Lord Cedric will require his chambers refreshed and a private meal arranged for this evening," he said. Then in a slightly different register, Lower and more careful. Be thorough with the chambers. Check everything. Cora looked at him. Is there something specific I should be looking for? Dane's quick eyes held hers for a moment. Lord Cedric, he said, has visited Dawnmere twice in the past year. Both times. Information that should not have left these walls did. The implications settled between them like cold water. I'll be thorough, she said. Dane nodded. He turned to leave, then stopped. You've been here 3 weeks, he said without turning around. The servants' hall runs better than it has in 2 years. Gareth noticed. I noticed. A pause. The king noticed. He left before she could respond. Bertha, who had been stirring a pot with great concentration throughout this exchange, said without looking up, Told you. Asset. Lord Cedric's chambers were on the upper floor of the west wing, a set of rooms that were larger and better appointed than most of the keep's guest quarters. Cora oversaw their preparation personally. Fresh linens, candles replaced, the hearth laid with good, dry pine that would burn clean and bright. While the younger serving girls swept the hearth, Cora moved through the room with the quiet attention she brought to everything, straightening, checking, observing. She found it behind the loose stone beside the window embrasure, a narrow gap in the mortar, not natural erosion, but deliberate, the edges too clean. Inside the gap, folded small and thin, was a piece of parchment. She did not unfold it. She did not read it. She pressed the stone back into place, finished the room's preparation, sent the serving girl back to the kitchen with instructions about the evening meal, and went directly to find Dane. He read the parchment, which turned out to contain a partial record of the king's planned patrol routes for the eastern border, with an expression of absolute stillness that was more frightening than anger would have been. You didn't read it, he said. It wasn't mine to read, she said. He looked at her then with something new in his expression, not the measured assessment of the past 3 weeks, but something that had resolved, like a question finally answered. I'll take this to the king, he said. I know, she said. I also think you should know that Lord Cedric spent 20 minutes in the great hall before the meal talking to your youngest gate guard, the one who looks nervous when spoken to by nobility. Dane went very still. How do you know this? Pip was in the stable, she said. He tells me everything he sees. I've learned to listen. She did not expect to be summoned that evening, but after the household had settled, and the children were asleep, and she was sitting by her fire reviewing the next week's provisions, a quiet knock came at her door, and when she opened it, it was not a guard or a servant. It was Aiden. He stood in her doorway without his armor, plain dark tunic, leather breeches, his braids loose, the scar on his cheekbone catching the corridor lamplight. He looked without the weight of his kingly presentation, like a man who had been thinking hard about something, and had decided to stop thinking and simply go where the thinking kept leading him. May I come in? He said. She stepped back from the door. He came in, looked briefly at the modest room, the children's cloaks hung by the door, Pip's wooden cup on the table, the mended hem on the chair by the fire, and then looked at her with those blue eyes that she had been carefully not thinking about for 3 weeks. Dane told me what you found, he said, and what you observed. It seemed relevant. She said, it was. He was quiet for a moment. Cedric has been selling information to the Northern Lords for 2 seasons. We suspected we needed confirmation. He paused. You gave us the thread we needed to pull. She folded her hands in front of her. I did what seemed right. You could have read that parchment, he said. You could have used it. Information like that has value for someone in an uncertain position. My position isn't uncertain, she said with a steadiness she almost entirely felt. I know what I am. I know what I'm here to do. I don't need other people's secrets to secure my own ground. He looked at her for a long time. The fire crackled between them. Somewhere in the next room, one of the children shifted in sleep inside. Why did you warn me about the children? He said in the hall at Ashvale. You said it as if you expected it to change my mind. She met his gaze. Because most people, when they understand what comes with me, decide the cost is too high. Most people, he said quietly, have never run a kingdom that echoes." She didn't know what to say to that. She didn't say anything. He moved toward the door and then stopped with his hand on the frame, his back half turned, and said without looking at her, "Cedric will be gone by morning. The gate guard will be reassigned somewhere he can't be approached." A pause. "You and your children are safe here. Cora, I want you to know that he said it the way he had said everything. Low, unhurried, as if the words had been true for longer than he had been saying them. She stood by her fire after the door closed and listened to the keep settle around her, the distant sound of a guard's boots on the upper walk, the sigh of wind against the stone, the soft breathing of 4 children in the next room. "Safe," he had said. She pressed her hand briefly to the doorframe where the warmth from the corridor lamp had barely reached, and felt the cold stone under her palm. She had not felt safe, truly, quietly, deeply safe in 4 years. She was not entirely sure what to do with it. Lord Cedric left Dawnmere before dawn without ceremony or farewell, escorted to the eastern road by 6 of Aiden's guards in the particular silence that surrounds a man who has been caught and knows it. Cora learned of his departure from Bertha, who announced it over the morning porridge with the satisfaction of someone delivering long-awaited news. "Good riddance," Bertha said, and ladled an extra portion into Pip's bowl without being asked. Cora said nothing. She drank her tea and watched the frost on the kitchen window catch the first pale light of morning and thought about a hand on a doorframe and the word safe and the particular weight it carried when spoken by someone who understood what its absence felt like. Dane found her in the linen stores that afternoon. He came in without the usual guardedness, closed the door behind him with deliberate care, and stood for a moment looking at the shelves of folded cloth as if organizing his words, the way she organized the linen by weight and purpose. "The king hasn't taken a meal in the Great Hall in 2 years, he said finally. "He eats in his study alone mostly, or with me and Gareth when there's business to discuss." He paused. "He hasn't trained in the courtyard where anyone could see him in longer than that." Cora kept her hands moving through the stack of wool blankets she was counting. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because he did both of those things this past week," Dane said. "And I think you know what changed." She set down the blanket. She turned and looked at him directly at those quick, assessing eyes that had spent 3 weeks deciding what category she belonged in. "Say what you mean," she said. Dane met her gaze. "I was against bringing you here," he said plainly. "I thought it was a complication. An omega from a village market with 4 children and no pack bond. I thought it was sentiment dressed up as practicality, and I don't trust sentiment when it comes to the king's safety." He paused. "I was wrong about you. I want you to know that I know it." The linen room was quiet. Through the small high window, the winter sky was the flat white of snow preparing to fall. "And now?" she asked. "Now I think," he said carefully, "that you should know the full truth of what you've walked into before it walks further into you." He told her in the linen room, standing among the folded wool and pressed linen while the snow began outside. Aiden had been Alpha King for 9 years, ascending after his father's death in a border conflict that had taken half the king's guard, and left the kingdom in a fragile peace that required constant maintenance. He had been 24 years old and already scarred. The line on his cheekbone from a blade in that same conflict, the older, invisible ones from a childhood in a court that had never been gentle. He had built Dawnmere back from the edge of fracture through 9 years of unrelenting work and ironclad discipline, and in the process had sealed himself away from everything that wasn't duty. He'd had a mate once, brief and ended by illness, before it had fully become what it was supposed to become. Her name had been Sarah, a beta noble, and she had died in the 2nd year of his reign from a fever that swept through the northern provinces. He had grieved in private thoroughly, and had not allowed himself to move toward anyone since. "He carries it like armor," Dane said. "The distance he thinks it protects the people around him." "From what?" Cora asked. "From loss," Dane said. "He believes the people he allows close pay a price for it eventually." The snow was falling properly now, soft and steady past the high window. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked again. More quietly. Dane was quiet for a moment. "Because he asked about your children again this morning. He asked if Bram had enough candles in the archive room. He asked if Sella's cough from last week had cleared. He paused. Aiden doesn't ask about people unless they've gotten somewhere he didn't plan to let them reach. She thought about it for 3 days. She thought about it while she managed the kitchen provisioning and settled a disagreement between 2 of the upper servants about the rotation of hall duties. She thought about it while she helped Pip practice his letters by firelight and braided Sella's hair and listened to Bram explain in careful detail a map of the eastern provinces he had studied in the archive. She thought about it while Marin sat across from her in the evenings with that quiet, watchful face, not saying anything about kings or watching, or the difference between how people look at horses and how they look at something they're afraid of losing. On the 4th day, she went to the eastern study. She knocked. She heard his voice say, "Enter," and she opened the door. He was at the large oak table, maps spread across it, a half-burned candle at his elbow, and ink on 2 fingers of his right hand. He looked up when she came in, and something in his expression shifted in the particular way it always did, that slight unlocking like a room that had been closed all day, finally opening its window. "Cora," he said. "I need to tell you something," she said, and came further into the room, standing on the other side of the map table with her hands folded in front of her. "And I think it's better to say it plainly, rather than let it sit and become something neither of us planned for." He set down his quill. He gave her his full attention in the way he gave everything his full attention completely, without division. "I know about Sarah," she said. "Dane told me. I'm not saying that to use it. I'm saying it because you should know that I understand something about building a life after loss, about deciding that smaller and safer is better than open and vulnerable." She held his gaze. "I made that decision, too. For 4 years. I made it every day." The candle flame moved between them in a draft from the window. "And now," he said. His voice was very quiet. "Now I'm standing in your study telling you the truth," she said, "which means I've already stopped making it." The room was still. Outside, the snow had stopped, and the sky had cleared to a deep, cold blue, and the last light of the afternoon was coming through the tall windows at a low angle that caught the dust motes above the maps and made them look briefly like something deliberate. Aiden rose from the table. He came around it slowly, not quickly, giving her every opportunity to step back, or look away, or change the direction of whatever this was. She did none of those things. He stopped arm's length from her. He looked at her the way he had in the market, as if she had surprised him, and he was still deciding what to make of it. And the deciding itself was something he didn't want to stop. "I don't know how to do this carefully," he said. "I've governed a kingdom. I've held borders and managed councils and negotiated with lords who wanted me dead. I don't know how to do this without the possibility of making it worse." "Neither do I," she said. "But I know how to do difficult things anyway." Something broke open in his expression. Not dramatically, not with collapse, but with the slow, certain quality of ice releasing a river in the first true week of spring. He reached out and took her hand, both of his around hers, warm and careful. "Your children," he said. "All 4 of them. Whatever this becomes, they are part of it. Not a condition I'm accommodating. Part of it." Her throat tightened. She had not expected that to be the thing that undid her composure, but it was. "Marin will interrogate you," she said, her voice only slightly unsteady constantly. "Good," he said. "Someone should." It did not become simple after that. Nothing real ever does. There were weeks of careful, deliberate steps, shared meals that began as household occasions and gradually became something more specific, conversations in the study over maps and candlelight that wandered far from matters of governance, moments in the corridor or the courtyard where they passed each other, and the ordinary distance between 2 people felt altered, as if the air between them had changed its composition. Dane watched with the expression of a man whose calculations had proven correct in a way he hadn't fully anticipated. Gareth made no comment, which from Gareth was the equivalent of enthusiastic endorsement. Bertha made explicit comment constantly, and with great satisfaction. The children were their own separate matter. Pip accepted Aiden with the uncomplicated openness of someone who had already approved of the horse, and therefore found the man attached to it perfectly reasonable. Sella accepted him after he sat through 40 minutes of her explaining in detail the echo properties of the upper corridor, and had listened with what appeared to be genuine interest. Bram accepted him quietly and completely the day Aidan found him in the archive room, and sat down across from him at the map table and spent an hour looking at the Eastern Province records in silence without asking Bram to explain himself or leave. Merrin took longer. She watched. She assessed. She asked questions that were more pointed than questions from a 9-year-old had any right to be about governance and borders and the fate of Omegas without pact bonds, and what happened to people who depended on kings, and then found the kings were gone. Aidan answered every one of them without deflection, without performing patience, without talking to her as if her age reduced the validity of the questions. On the morning of the first true thaw, when the frost had retreated from the walled garden, and something green was tentatively reconsidering its position beneath the snow, Merrin appeared at Cora's door before breakfast. "He answered all my questions," she said. "I know," Cora said. "He answered them like they mattered." They did. Merrin considered this. "All right," she said, which was from Merrin everything. The bond came on a morning in early spring, spoken not in ceremony, but in the study, quietly, with Dane and Ba as witnesses, and 4 children present. Pip, solemn and wide-eyed, Sella fidgeting until Bram put a hand on her arm, Merrin perfectly still with her gray eyes, holding something that looked carefully concealed, like relief. Aidan spoke the words of claiming with his hands around Cora's and his blue eyes on her face, steady and certain and completely without performance. She spoke her answer in a voice that did not waver. When it was done, the mark settled at the curve of her neck like something that had always been waiting to exist, warm and permanent. Dane cleared his throat and looked at the ceiling. Bertha wept openly and without embarrassment. Pip said, "Does this mean we live here forever?" "Yes," Aidan said. Pip nodded, satisfied. "Good," he said. Oswin said, "The brown mare is going to have a foal in summer." Summer came to Dawnmere with the smell of pine and warm stone, and the sound of a keep that had remembered how to be inhabited. The walled garden bloomed. Someone had planted it quietly while the frost was still leaving, and when Cora asked Aidan about it, he said only that it had seemed like the right time. The foal was born in late summer and was small and dark and immediately named by Pip without consultation. Captain, a name that Oswin accepted with the dignity of a man choosing his battles. Lord Cedric, it was discovered, had been working in coordination with 2 other border lords who had long resented Dawnmere's authority. The evidence Cora had found had allowed Dane to unravel the full scope of it, a network of past information and quiet sabotage that had been operating for nearly 3 years. The 3 lords were brought before the King's Council, stripped of their border privileges and placed under the governance of appointed wardens. There was no blood. There was no public spectacle. The network simply ceased quietly and completely, like a fire denied its air. Gareth, reorganizing the diplomatic records afterward, made a note in his careful hand that the matter had been resolved through, among other things, the observational acuity of the keep's domestic head and the candid reports of a 5-year-old in a stable yard. He then crossed out the second part, thought about it, and wrote it back in. The last evening of summer, Cora stood in the walled garden with the last of the light fading over the keep's eastern tower, the air warm and smelling of late roses and dry grass, the sound of the children's voices drifting from the upper window of the eastern wing, where Bertha had them occupied with the preparation of something that involved a great deal of flour and debate. Aidan came to stand beside her. They had done this many times now, stood in the garden in the evening, with the day settling around them, and the keep quiet at their backs. It was a habit that had grown without planning like most of the real things between them. He took her hand. "Merrin asked me today," he said, "about succession law." Cora turned to look at him. "She's 9. She had very specific questions," he said. There was the warmth in his eyes that had started as almost smiles in a market and had become something she could read the way she read weather. "I answered them, and she said." He paused that the laws seemed designed for a different kind of family than the kind that actually works. Cora looked at him for a long moment. The last light caught the scar on his cheekbone and the silver clasp at his collar and the loose strands of his dark braids. And she thought, not for the first time and certainly not for the last, that the world had a very strange sense of how to arrange things. "She's not wrong," Cora said. "No," he agreed. "She rarely is." From the upper window, Sella's voice carried down into the garden with the clarity of someone who had spent considerable time studying acoustics. "Mama Bram put too much salt in, and Pip says, it's fine, but it is not fine." Aiden's expression completed its journey from almost smile to full warmth, unhurried and unguarded, the face of a man who had spent 9 years in a keep that echoed, and had stopped noticing the silence somewhere between a market in Ashvale and a morning in early spring when 4 children watched him speak a promise and a 5-year-old had asked if they were staying forever. Cora squeezed his hand and turned toward the door.